The air in the scriptorium was thick with the dust of forgotten aeons, a silence broken only by the hum of a single lumen orb and the soft scratch of an autoquill on vellum. Archivist Thaler sat hunched over a data slate, its cold green light carving his weary features from the gloom. Before him lay the forbidden lore of the Ordo Xenos, a tome of horrors bound in the flayed skin of some unknown creature. He was merely a custodian, a ghost condemned to catalogue the nightmares of the Imperium. His gloved finger traced a line of high Gothic text, a classified report that had been sealed for 3 standard centuries. Ordo Xenos Report 77 Delta. Classification Malleus Incarnadine. Subject the Ghoul Stars. Addendum by Inquisitor Lord Varistus. Let it be recorded for the eyes of the Ordo alone. Our charts of the galaxy are a lie, a comforting falsehood we tell ourselves in the dark. We map the blazing fires of chaos, the encroaching shadows of the Tyrannid, the green tide of the Orc, and believe we know the shape of our enemies. We are fools. The Ghoul Stars are not a region of space. They are a wound in the fabric of reality, a patch of celestial gangrene where the laws of physics go to die. It is a void that does not merely lack light, but actively consumes it. It is a silence that does not merely lack sound, but suffocates it. We sent 6 fleets into that darkness over the millennia. None returned. Their light, their echoes, their very memory was devoured. Let this be a warning. The greatest threat is not the enemy we know, but the fundamental truth we are too arrogant to accept, that the galaxy does not belong to us. It never did. The Ghoul Stars are not an absence of imperial control. They are the presence of something else entirely. Something ancient, patient, and utterly indifferent to our existence. Thaler shivered a deep, bone-felt chill that had nothing to do with the scriptorium's temperature. He activated a secondary cogitator, its gears grinding in protest as it accessed a data file even more restricted than the report. Audio log 991 final. Vessel designation: the Starseeker's Folly, an Imperial exploration cruiser lost M38. A burst of static flooded the chamber, a sound like tearing metal and shattering glass. Through the noise, a voice strained and broken screamed into the void. Log of Captain Vallon. Day. I don't know the day. The chrono counters are running backwards. The stars. Oh, by the throne, the stars are singing the wrong song. It's not a sound, it's a resonance. It gets inside your teeth, inside your bones. It's unmaking us. The static shifted, and a new sound bled through a low melodic hum that was profoundly unnatural, a chord that seemed to have too many notes. We saw them. Vallon's voice was a ragged whisper now laced with a terrible awe. Not ships, not creatures, phantoms that drink the light. They pass through the hull like it's not there, and where they pass, there's just nothing. Not a hole, not damage, just absence. Crewman John walked into one. He didn't scream. He just stopped being. A wet, choking sound. Someone was weeping in the background of the recording. The navigator is dead. He looked into the warp and said it was empty. A perfect, silent sea. But he said something was looking back from the silence. The astropath. She just keeps drawing spirals. Over and over. Says she's charting the shape of hunger. The hum grew louder, the alien melody becoming a dominant, oppressive presence in the recording. It knows we're here now. It's turning its gaze upon us. We thought we were explorers, but we were just food, wandering into the mouth of a god, the empty throne, the hunger with a shape. It's not in the stars. It is the stars. May the Emperor forgive our foolishness. The voice cut off, replaced by a final deafening shriek of static that seemed to tear at the very air in the scriptorium. And then silence. A profound, heavy silence that felt worse than the noise. Archivist Thaler leaned back, his heart a cold hammer in his chest. He had reviewed thousands of final logs, heard the death cries of fleets, the madness of crews lost to the warp. But this was different. This wasn't the rage of chaos or the hunger of Xenos. This was the cold, dispassionate terror of a universe that did not even recognize humanity's right to exist. The Starseeker's folly hadn't been destroyed. It had been erased. He looked at the star charts on his wall, the proud maps of the Imperium of Man, and for the first time he saw them not as a testament to power, but as the frantic scribblings of a child on the walls of his prison, ignorant of the silent watching warden standing just outside the door. The bridge of the rogue trader vessel Void Serpent was a chapel of silent wealth. Ornate brass fixtures gleamed under the cold emergency lighting. Velvet-cushioned command thrones sat empty, their occupants vanished. A fine layer of frost born from the dead life support systems coated every surface. Standing amidst the frozen stillness was Inquisitor Valerius Kane. He was a stark figure in his severe black sin-skin coat, his face a mask of intense concentration. The silver rosette of his office pinned to his collar seemed to absorb the dim light. Report. Kane's voice was low-cutting through the silence without disturbing it. A Kasrkin sergeant in full carapace armor stood rigidly at his side, hellgun held at a low ready. No change, my lord. No bodies, no signs of struggle. The larder is full, the armory untouched. The cargo hold contains 10,000 tons of refined promethium. Nothing of value has been taken. The crew is simply gone. Kane knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of a grotesque carving in the deck plating. It was a spiral, jagged and crude, etched deep into the metal. Dozens like it covered the bridge on the walls across the crystal viewports, even on the faces of the silent instrument panels. Not quite nothing, Sergeant Kane murmured. He pointed to the dark flecks embedded in the grooves. Forensics confirmed it. Blood, keratin, and dental enamel. They carved these with their own fingernails and teeth. The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. Madness, my lord. Simple void madness. Madness has a reason, Sergeant Kane replied, rising to his full height. Warp exposure Xenos pheromones disease. This is different. This is a symptom, not the cause. There is a pattern here. A desperate, terrified pattern. He ran a hand over his clean-shaven head, his grey eyes scanning the desecrated bridge. He had built his reputation on pursuing threats that the Orders refused to see the anomalies that slipped through the cracks of established dogma. This felt like one of them. It felt hungry. A crackle from his personal Vox link broke the quiet. My Lord Inquisitor. The voice was female, modulated by augmetics, every syllable precise and devoid of emotion. A discovery has been made. Proceed, Magos Lyra Kane answered. The main cogitator bay of the Void Serpent was a web of cables and machinery, all cold and inert. Moving through it with the silent grace of a machine was Magos Explorator Lyra. More than half of her body was gleaming silver chrome. A cluster of mechadendrites sprouted from her back, their tips probing, scanning, and interfacing with the dead systems. Her optical sensors, glowing with a soft blue light, were focused on a single data core she had isolated from the main drive. The ship's logs were wiped clean, her voice echoed from a Vox grill on her throat. A complete surgical erasure. However, I located a shielded fragment deep within a tertiary memory bank. It is not of Imperial origin. Kane's voice came back sharp with interest. Xenos Eldar Orcish scrap code. Negative on all known classifications, Lyra stated. One of her mechadendrites, tipped with a needle-fine injector, was plugged into the core. The encryption is unconventional. It is not structured like a language or a set of commands. The binary code mimics the firing patterns of a human cerebral cortex. It's less a message and more a fossilized thought translated into machine code. She paused, a rare occurrence. It is profoundly strange. Can you decrypt it? Kane asked. I can, Lyra replied, a hint of what might have been academic pride in her synthesized voice. Though I advise caution. Its energy signature is dormant but possesses a quantum structure I have never encountered. I will begin the decryption sequence now, routing the output to your personal data slate and the astropathic choir. On the bridge of Kane's own vessel, the Dauntless-class cruiser Vigilance, a young woman named Ilara sat in a copper-walled sanctum. She was the ship's astropath, her eyes sealed behind strips of embroidered silk, her face pale and drawn. She was Kane's whisper in the dark, his link to the vast emptiness between worlds. The decryption sequence began as a low hum in her mind, a trickle of data she was meant to observe, not engage. But then the fossil opened. The trickle became a flood. An ice-cold torrent of psychic energy slammed into her. Ilara screamed a raw, soul-tearing sound that echoed both in the sanctum and through the minds of every psyker within 1,000 miles. She convulsed on her thrown hands, clawing at her silken eye covering. On the bridge of the Void Serpent, Kane staggered as the psychic scream ripped through his own latent sensitivity. The Kazarkin sergeant cried out, dropping to one knee. Kane gripped his slate, where a single corrupted audio file now appeared. Ilara's voice filtered through the vox was no longer human. It was a conduit for 1 billion years of silence and hunger. No, not a song. A vibration. A hunger that has a shape. It sits on an empty throne between the dead stars. The folly, the Starseekers. It's calling. It's always calling. Kane stared at the file name on his slate. It was corrupted, but 2 words were chillingly clear. Starseekers' folly. He looked at the frantic spirals carved into the walls of the dead ship. He looked out the viewport at the cold, indifferent stars of the Calixis sector. He had found his pattern, and he knew with a certainty that froze his soul that this was only the beginning. The chamber was a vault of judgment carved from the asteroid heart of the Tricorn Palace. Stained glass windows, meters thick, depicted scenes of righteous imperial fury, saints purging aliens' armies, burning heretics. Seated behind a vast obsidian dais were 3 figures, their faces etched with the granite certainty of absolute power. Inquisitor Lord Tybalt, a man whose flesh was stretched taut over a framework of augmetics, sat in the center. At his sides were Inquisitor Rika, a zealot whose eyes burned with puritanical fire, and Inquisitor Shale, a woman whose placid face concealed a mind of razor-sharp cruelty. Valerius Kane stood alone in the center of the floor, the sole focus of their collective crushing gaze. A servo skull hovered beside him, projecting a shimmering hololith of the spiral glyphs and the corrupted data string from the Void Serpent. "Oh?" And the astropath's testimony is unequivocal. Kane concluded, his voice calm and steady, despite the oppressive atmosphere. The psychic signature matches residual traces found on the final log of the Starseeker's folly. We are not dealing with random void madness or a known Xenos incursion. This is a new threat, a contagion of the mind that erases its victims from existence. It emanates from the Ghoul Stars, and I request the authority and resources to lead an expeditionary force into that region. Inquisitor Riker scoffed a dry, rattling sound. A new threat or a new obsession, Kane. You have always chased shadows. You see heresy in dust motes and Xenos plots in stellar phenomena. The Ghoul Stars are a dead zone, a navigational impossibility. What you have found is the echo of a lost ship's madness, amplified by the psychic instability of the Calixis sector. You are proposing a crusade based on the ravings of a traumatized astropath and a ghost in a machine. It is a verifiable ghost, Inquisitor Kane countered. Magos Lyra has authenticated the data fragment's age and unique structure. It is a message in a bottle, and we would be fools to ignore it. Lord Tybalt leaned forward, his voice a low grinding of gears and synthesized speech. The Imperium is beset by 1 billion known threats. The Orcs rise in the east. The Tyranids devour from the galactic north. The great enemy claws at the very heart of the Segmentum Solar. Our resources are finite. Our warriors are precious. We cannot afford to waste them on your phantasms. Chasing novel forms of annihilation is a luxury we do not have. Worse, it is a heresy in itself, an implication that the enemies sanctioned by the God Emperor are not worthy of our full attention. So we should blind ourselves to anything that doesn't fit our scriptures. Kane's voice was laced with a dangerous edge of frustration. We should wait for this silence, this hunger to arrive at our doorstep before we acknowledge its existence. You are warned, Valerius Inquisitor Shale said, her voice soft as silk, but as cold as the void. Do not pursue these ghosts in the dark. Your mandate is to fight the enemies of man, not to invent new ones. The Conclave denies your request. The Void Serpent incident will be classified as lost to the perils of the warp. This inquiry is closed. Kane stood in the empty chamber long after they had gone, the images of the saints on the windows seeming to mock him. He was a sentinel who had seen a new fire on the horizon, but his masters had ordered him to keep his eyes on the old flames. They would not give him a mandate, so he would have to forge one in the shadows. That night, Kane's private chambers were a nexus of clandestine communication. A flickering astropathic projection sphere cast the gaunt, proud features of an old man onto the wall. His eyes were swirling vortexes of raw, warp stuff, the mark of a navigator of a high house. A disgraced house. Lord Inquisitor, the voice of Patriarch Vor of House Nomos, rasped. It has been many years. I trust you do not contact me for pleasantries. Your house was censured for charting unstable and forbidden routes, Vor Kane said, cutting to the chase. Rumor has it your ancestors charted the very edge of the Ghoul Stars before they were declared perdita. The navigator's image stiffened. Lies spread by our rivals to discredit us. Those charts are myths. I have a Dauntless-class cruiser fully supplied for a long-range voyage, Kane said, ignoring the denial. I have a need for a navigator who is not afraid of the dark. A navigator whose house is so far from grace, they would see a suicide mission as an opportunity. A successful voyage under the seal of an Inquisitor, no matter how unsanctioned, could do much to restore a tarnished reputation. A long silence stretched between them. Vor's vortex eyes seemed to study Kane, weighing the desperation against the danger. The price would be exorbitant, and my heir Cygnus would have to navigate. He is young, but he has the sight. He sees the quiet paths. Done, Kane said. Be at the Tartarus transshipment point in 3 days. The image of the navigator vanished. Kane then turned to a secure voxcaster, its frequency shielded by layers of Ordo Xenos encryption. He spoke a single code word. For an hour there was only static. Then a voice, deep and resonant as a funeral bell, answered. This is Captain Boros of the Voidstalkers 4th Company. You are using a priority inquisitorial code. State your purpose, Captain Boros Kane said respectfully. Your chapter's eternal vigil is over the unbeholden reaches, the spaces between the light. I have credible evidence of a non-corporeal existence-level threat originating from Sector 288 Delta, the Ghoul Stars. That region is a tomb, Boros's voice rumbled. Nothing lives there. Something starves there. Kane corrected. I am going in. The Conclave has refused to sanction the mission, but your chapter's remit transcends the Conclave's politics. It answers to the threat, not the bureaucracy. I am offering you a chance to confront an enemy worthy of your vigil. Another silence. Kane could almost hear the centuries of duty and patience weighing on the Space Marine's decision. An enemy that is not chaos nor Xenos as we know it. An enemy that is the void itself given will. A worthy hunt, the captain's voice concluded without a trace of emotion. My strike force will rendezvous with your vessel, the Vigilance at the appointed coordinates. We will hold the line, for the Emperor. The Vox went dead. Days later, the hangar bay of the Vigilance was a hive of frantic, tense activity. Void stalkers clad in midnight blue power armor, adorned with stark white skulls, moved with quiet purpose, securing their war gear. The ship's crew, a motley collection of hard-eyed naval ratings, disgraced armsmen, and void-born outcasts who owed Kane their lives, gave the Astartes a wide berth. The tension was a palpable thing, a low hum of anxiety that vibrated through the deck plates. In her laboratory, Magos Lyra was hunched over a cogitator, utterly absorbed by the data fragment. She had copied it, dissected it, run 1,000 simulations. It was an obsession, now a perfect, impossible puzzle that whispered of knowledge beyond the comprehension of the Adeptus Mechanicus. In the astropathic sanctum, Ilara had not left her throne. She was thinner, paler, a ghost haunted by a psychic echo. She had ringed her chambers with silver wards and purity seals, but Kane knew it was a futile gesture. The silence she had touched in the Ghoul Stars was already inside her. She was their canary, their early warning system, and the burden was slowly killing her. Kane stood on the bridge of his ship looking out at the starfield. He had his ship, his crew of pariahs, and his alliances with the disgraced and the dutiful. It was a fleet of the damned sailing on a tide of heresy and hope toward an abyss that had swallowed fleets before. He had his mandate written not in imperial law, but in the shadows of necessity. The Bridge of the Vigilance was a storm of controlled chaos. Through the armored viewport, the impossible non-Euclidean energies of the Empyrean writhed and churned a tempest of raw emotion and spectral predators. The ship shuddered, groaning like a leviathan in pain as it tore its way through the very fabric of insanity. At the heart of it all, enthroned within a crackling sphere of protective wards, sat the navigator Cygnus Nomos. He was young, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his third eye on his forehead wide and staring into the madness, searching for the one true constant in the chaos. The Emperor's light still guides us, but it is faint, my Lord Cygnus's voice strained and thin echoed through the bridge's vox, like the last candle in a hurricane. We are approaching the calculated emergence point. The veil is thin. Inquisitor Kane stood unmoving at the command dais, his hands clasped behind his back. Hold your course, navigator. We are pilgrims to an unholy land. We cannot falter at the gate. The ship's first officer, a grim, scar-faced woman named Cascade, checked the chrono. Materium reversion in 10, 9, 8. The crew braced themselves, their knuckles white on their consoles. The roar of the warp reached a deafening crescendo. 3, 2, 1. The transition was not a lurch, but a sudden sickening cessation. The violent shuddering stopped. The screaming chaos vanished. The Geller field collapsed with a silent sigh of discharged energy. All at once there was a profound and absolute stillness. Cascade let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Reversion complete. All systems nominal. Auger arrays are scanning. She trailed off, her brow furrowed as she stared at her console. My lord, I don't understand these readings. Kane stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the main viewport. Where there should have been a star field, a familiar tapestry of distant suns and nebulae, there was nothing. It was not the black of deep space dotted with points of light. It was a perfect flat, featureless black, a sheet of absolute void that seemed to soak up the light from the bridge. There were no stars, no nebulae, no distant galaxies. Nothing. What are the augurs showing? Kane demanded, his voice low. That's just it, Sir Cascade replied. Her voice tinged with disbelief. They show nothing. Not empty space. An absolute vacuum. No background radiation, no stray particles, no gravitational fluctuations. According to every sensor we have, the universe outside this ship simply isn't there. A heavy silence fell over the bridge crew. To be lost in the void was a common fear, but to be in a void that shouldn't exist, a place where the universe itself seemed to have been erased, was a new and profound terror. Kane's hand went to his vox speed. Astropath Ilara, report. Where is the light of the Astronomicon? The connection was clear, but the voice that answered was a fragile, terrified whisper. It's gone, my lord. It's just gone. One moment it was there, a single note of hope in the distance. Now, nothing. And the warp Kane pressed. What do you feel? There was a pause filled with the sound of Ilara's ragged breathing. That is the horror, my lord. I feel nothing. The great ocean, the sea of souls, it has always been a symphony of torment. The screams of the damned, the whispers of the gods, the echoes of a trillion souls. It was monstrous, but it was present. Her voice broke. Now it is silent. There is no symphony, no choir, just a crushing, suffocating silence. It's not empty, my lord. It's listening. We are a single screaming nerve in a body that is vast and ancient and asleep, and I fear we are beginning to wake it up. The first sign that the laws of reality were fraying came an hour later. A junior tech priest monitoring internal security picts let out a sharp cry. "Bridge, this is Enginarium Deck 7. I have a visual anomaly." On the main screen, a pict feed from a corridor deep within the ship flickered. For a single terrifying second, the familiar grey, steel-walled passage was replaced by a long, arching hall made of a material that seemed to be solidified shadow twisting at angles that hurt the eye. Then just as quickly it was gone, leaving the normal corridor in its place. It was not our ship, the tech priest stammered. Before Cascade could respond, another report came in. "My lord, it's Magos Lyra. We are experiencing cascading logic faults in the lower deck servitor population." Kane switched the channel. "Explain, Magos." "The servitors are deviating from their programmed litanies." Lyra's synthesized voice was tight with confusion. "Unit 3 Gamma, a maintenance drone, has ceased its work. It is standing in a corridor, turning in a slow circle, chanting a binary string." "What is it saying?" Kane asked. "I have translated it," my lord, Lyra replied. The slight pause before she spoke was more telling than any emotional inflection. It is repeating one phrase over and over. "The angles are hungry. The lines are wrong. Reality is thin." Kane looked from the blank, starless void on the viewport to the flickering pict feed, and a cold understanding began to dawn. The crew of the Starseeker's Folly had spoken of a song that could unmake reality. They had not realized they were already hearing the first few notes. The enemy wasn't something they would have to find. They were already inside it. The ship was no longer a vessel traveling through the Ghoul Stars. It was a foreign body, a tiny infection in a vast and slumbering organism, and the organism's immune system was beginning to take notice. For days, the vigilance drifted through the oppressive, starless nothingness. The silence was a constant pressure against the hull, a weight on the souls of the crew. Then the augurs registered something. Not a ship, not a planet, but a vast field of high-density objects appearing from nowhere, as if the ship had just crossed an invisible boundary. On the viewport, a scene of cosmic horror unfolded. It was a graveyard of ships, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, suspended silently in the black. There were the familiar, brutal silhouettes of Imperial cruisers, the elegant bone-like shapes of Elder craft, the crude asteroid hulks of Orc vessels, and dozens of others whose architecture defied any known classification, twisted and alien. They were not wreckage from a battle. There were no plasma burns, no torpedo holes, no signs of impact. They were pristine, yet utterly dead, like ancient sea creatures that had simply expired and sunk into an abyssal trench. They looked as if they had aged 1,000,000 years in a single moment by the throne. Cascade whispered, her voice filled with awe and dread. "What is this place? A warning?" Kane said grimly, his eyes scanning the fleet of ghosts. He pointed to one of the Imperial ships, a Dictator-class cruiser whose name was still faintly visible on its prow, Emperor's Faith. "Prepare a boarding party. Captain Boros, your Void Stalkers will take the lead. I want to know what happened here." The boarding action was eerily quiet. The umbilical locked onto the Emperor's Faith with a hollow clang that echoed through the dead ship. Inside, the air was cold, sterile, and still. Emergency lumens cast a ghostly pale light over corridors that were unnervingly pristine. There was no dust, no decay, no sign of the passage of time. "There is no life." Captain Boros stated, his helmet's autosensors sweeping the area. "No residual heat, no biological traces. It is a tomb." They found the crew everywhere, or rather what was left of them. At their posts on the bridge, in the medici bay and the mess hall, Each was a perfectly preserved uniform, filled with a pile of fine grey ash. Bones, flesh organs, all had disintegrated into a homogeneous, lifeless dust. A tech priest lay slumped over his console, his robes and augmetics immaculate, but the organic components within were nothing but powder. Kane found the captain's log on the bridge. The final entry was not written, but scratched into the plasteel with a trembling hand. The last few words were barely legible. Day 47 in the silent void. The crew is reporting temporal distortions. Men see their own aged corpses in the reflections. The astropath says the silence has a shape now, a shape made of corners. It is watching us from the corners of our eyes. It is watching us from the corners of the corridors. It is watching us from the corners. The scratching ended abruptly. My lord, a void stalker voxed from the observation deck. We have movement. Outside. Kane and Boros rushed to the viewport. For a moment they saw nothing but the silent fleet and their own ship, the Vigilance, tethered to the cruiser. Then something detached itself from the hull of a nearby, unidentifiable Xenos vessel. It wasn't a ship or a creature. It was a patch of wrongness, a mobile impossibility. It was a cluster of razor-sharp angles and shifting geometric planes that seemed to fold in on themselves, existing in 3 dimensions, and yet violating all of them. It was a living, moving piece of non-Euclidean geometry. It moved without propulsion, gliding through the void with an unnerving purpose. It wasn't heading for the boarding party, it was heading for the Vigilance. "Cascade, all hands brace for impact!" Kane yelled into his vox. Sever the umbilical now. But it didn't impact. The thing, the collection of impossible angles, simply passed through the aft section of the Vigilance. It made no sound. There was no explosion, no tearing of metal. The entity drifted serenely through the portside engine nacelle and out the other side. And the section of the ship it had touched, a 50-meter chunk of armor, plasma conduits and crew quarters, was simply gone. There was no hole, no wreckage, no vacuum breach. The ship's hull was now seamlessly sealed where the engine had been, as if it had been built that way. The 50-meter section and the dozens of crew within had not been destroyed. They had been edited out of reality. The entity drifted away, disappearing back into the forest of dead ships. Kane stared, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. This was the horror of the Ghoul Stars. It was not an enemy that killed. It was a universe that unmade. The Vigilance limped through the graveyard of ships, a wounded animal in a silent abattoir. Magos Lyra's tech priests worked frantically to comprehend the damage, but there was nothing to comprehend. Schematics now showed the ship had always been built without the aft engine section. The ship's machine spirit was unconfused. Only the crew's memories screamed that something was wrong. They were adrift, crippled, in a place where reality itself was a predator. It was then that the signal came, faint, structured, and shockingly familiar. A Vox officer, his face pale, turned to Kane. "My lord, I am receiving a signal from that nearby planet." On the main screen, a world of pale blue and white swam into view, a ball of ice hanging in the absolute black. "What is it?" Kane asked. "It's an Imperial hymn, my lord," the officer said, his voice trembling slightly as he played the audio. "The canticle of the Emperor's ascension." The sound that filled the bridge was a discordant horror. It was the right melody, the right notes, but it was utterly devoid of human feeling. It was a mechanical, soulless repetition, slightly distorted, as if being played on a warped Pict recorder stuck in an endless loop. It was a song of faith, stripped of all faith, leaving only an empty, mocking echo. "It is a lure or a ghost," Captain Boros rumbled, his helmeted head turning towards the screen. Either way, it is an answer of a kind, Kane decided. In this ocean of nothing, any port in a storm will have to do. We are explorers, Captain. Let us explore. The landing party descended onto a world of breathtaking, silent beauty. They stood on a vast plain of smooth, pale blue ice, under a sky with no sun illuminated by a faint, sourceless luminescence. Before them stood a city, but not one of stone or steel. It was a forest of crystalline spires that soared into the sky, refracting the dim light into a billion shimmering colors. The only sound was the faint, ever-present, and deeply unsettling hymn that seemed to emanate not from a single source, but from the very air, the ice, the crystals themselves. As they walked the silent streets, they found the inhabitants. Thousands of them. They were humanoid in shape, frozen in place. Some were kneeling as if in prayer, others stood with arms outstretched, and many simply stared up at the largest central spire, their faces captured in expressions of rapture, terror, or sorrow. They were not made of flesh, but of a shimmering, translucent crystal that mirrored the city around them. They were beautiful and terrifying. A Void Stalker reached out a gauntleted hand to touch one. "Solid as plasteel," he reported. "They are statues." "No," Kane breathed, stepping closer to a figure of a woman, her crystal face etched with a look of profound wonder. "They are not statues, they are recordings." The hymn seemed to be humming directly from their crystalline bodies. They were the speakers broadcasting their frozen final moment for all eternity. They moved towards the central spire, a single colossal shard of crystal that pulsed with a faint inner light. The entrance was a perfect archway leading into a vast, silent cavern. The hymn was louder here, a resonant thrum that vibrated in their bones. The chamber was filled with more crystal figures, but these were different. They wore the tattered remnants of Imperial Guard flak armor, the robes of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the simple Voidsman's jumpers of explorers. Magos Lyra moved forward a dozen sensor-tipped mechadendrites, emerging from her back, and gently probing one of the figures, a man in Akkadian uniform, his hand reaching for a lasgun that was also made of crystal. "What do you see?" Magos Kane asked. Lyra was silent for a long moment, her blue optical sensors glowing brightly as she processed terabytes of data. "My lord," she began, her synthesized voice unusually strained, "these are not replicas. The crystalline structures, they contain a matrix of fossilized neural pathways, faint residual synaptic energy. These are not recordings of men." She turned her glowing blue gaze to Kane. "They are the men. The planet. The planet appears to be a sentient organism, a vast geological archivist, a library. It does not kill those who land here. It collects them. It absorbs their consciousness, their memories, their experiences, and stores the data permanently in these crystalline forms. The process is perfect. The data is preserved forever. But the subject, the mind, the soul, the body is consumed. They are turned into books made of their own flesh and spirit." Kane looked around at the silent, beautiful statues. The man reaching for his lasgun. The tech priest with his head tilted as if listening to a fascinating new sound. The woman with the look of wonder on her face. They were all trapped, their final thoughts, their last moment of terror or awe converted into a single note in a hymn played on a loop for the rest of time. This place wasn't a city of the dead. It was a library of the damned. The landing party returned to the Vigilance. In grim silence, the images of the glass faces forever burned into their minds. They had barely begun the post-mission debriefing when the alarms screamed to life, a frantic, piercing shriek that signified imminent danger. "Proximity alert!" Officer Cascade yelled from the command throne. Multiple vessels emerging from the void dead ahead. On the main screen, reality seemed to tear open as a fleet of ships materialized from the absolute black. They were crescent-shaped, their design unmistakably Necron, but they were horrifically wrong. Their living metal hulls were not sleek and seamless, but pitted and corroded, scarred with millennia of self-inflicted damage. A sickly, baleful green light bled from them, and their movements were not the cold, calculated maneuvers of an ancient dynasty, but the frenzied, erratic lunges of starving predators. "They are not hailing us," the Vox officer reported, his voice tight with fear. "They are not deploying fighters, they are simply charging." Lances of Gorse energy, searing green beams that flayed matter atom by atom, lashed out from the derelict fleet. Explosions rocked the Vigilance as the ship's void shields flared, buckled and failed under the suicidal assault. "Brace for impact, boarding torpedoes incoming," Cascade roared. The battle for the Vigilance was not a battle. It was an infestation. The Necron torpedoes punched through the already damaged hull, and from their ruined interiors spilled the stuff of nightmares. They were not the implacable silent legions of the Necron dynasties. They were skeletal metal warriors draped in rotting tapestries of flayed skin and flesh trophies from 1,000 forgotten victims. Their metallic fingers were elongated into razor-sharp talons, and their optical lenses burned with a mad, hungry light. The flayed ones. "Hold the line!" Captain Boros's voice boomed through the ship-wide vox. "For the Emperor." The corridors of the Vigilance became a slaughterhouse. The Void Stalkers formed a bulwark of midnight blue ceramite against the tide of twitching, skittering metal. Bolter fire echoed in the confined spaces, each explosive shell punching through a Necron chassis only for another to take its place. But this was unlike any battle the Astartes had ever fought. The flayed ones did not fight with tactics or for strategic objectives. They fought with a desperate, all-consuming hunger. They lunged forward, ignoring bolter shells that ripped through their torsos, their claws scrabbling against power armor seeking purchase. They were not trying to kill their opponents efficiently. They were trying to peel them open. A Void Stalker wrestled with one of the abominations, its talons screeching as they gouged deep furrows in his pauldrons, trying to pry the helmet from his head. The Necron's silent metallic jaws snapped inches from his face, driven by an insane instinct to wear his skin. The scene was repeated throughout the ship, a grim tableau of superhuman warriors, fighting not against soldiers, but against a plague given metallic form. The tide of the battle turned in the main artery of Deck 3. There, standing over the fallen bodies of his own maddened warriors, was a Necron Lord. It was a larger figure, its frame once ornate, but now defiled with stretched weeping hides. One of its legs had been sheared off by a melter blast, and its single burning red eye flickered with a dying light. As Kane and Captain Boros advanced on it, it did not raise its weapon. It seemed to shudder, a spasm running through its entire body, as if fighting a war within itself. "End it!" A voice whispered, not through the air, but directly inside Kane's mind, a dry, static-laced hiss of ancient thought. The Lord staggered forward, its metal hand reaching out. A Void Stalker raised his bolter, but Kane motioned for him to wait. This was not an attack. This was a plea. The Necron Lord's fingers, cold and sharp, clamped onto Kane's helmet. Kane's world dissolved into a storm of green static and second-hand memories that stretched back millions of years. He saw a star god, a celestial being of pure hunger being shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. He felt a curse, a digital virus sinking into the minds of its jailers, inflicting an eternal gnawing hunger for the warm flesh they had long since lost. He saw legions of immortal warriors succumbing to madness, tearing at their own metal bodies, desperate to feel again. And he saw their pilgrimage. He understood. The Necrons were not here to conquer the Ghoul Stars. They were here as supplicants. They were chasing a ghost, a psychic echo of the entity that had cursed them, the Satan, Landugor the Flayer. They had been drawn into this silent void by the faintest promise that they could find the source of their agony. They had come not to fight a war, but to beg their long-dead god for a final release, or for the mercy of a true and final death. The attack on the Vigilance was not an act of war. It was the mindless lashing out of a dying, tormented patient. The vision ended. The Necron Lord's head slumped, the light in its eye extinguished. Its metal body, no longer sustained by its ancient will, rapidly oxidized, crumbling into a pile of red-brown dust and rotten flesh. Kane stood gasping, the cold reality of his mission crashing down upon him. He had come here seeking a monster, but all he found were its victims. Even the terrifying immortal Necrons were just another set of prisoners, trapped in the suffocating silence, screaming for a release that would never come. In the aftermath of the Flayed One attack, a new, more insidious horror began to fester aboard the Vigilance. The ship was repaired, the dead were given the rights of the void, but the silence that returned was different. It was a hungry silence, and it had found its way inside them. It began with small things. An officer on the bridge, a veteran of 100 battles, momentarily forgot the activation cant for the forward batteries. A mess hall menial stared blankly at a simple nutrient dispenser, unable to remember its function. Two armsmen who had served together for a decade had a conversation where one called the other by the wrong name, and neither of them noticed. These incidents, at first dismissed as combat fatigue, began to multiply. The errors became more severe. A tech priest forgot the litany to appease a failing plasma conduit, nearly causing a catastrophic overload. Officer Cascade was found standing in a corridor, unable to remember if she was heading to the bridge or coming from it. The affliction was a slow, creeping fog, a thief that stole the small certainties that held a mind together. The crew grew quiet and paranoid, clutching at memories like precious jewels, terrified that they too would turn to dust. In her laboratory, Magos Lyra worked tirelessly, her chrome fingers flying across data slates. The ship's Medicae was reporting widespread, inexplicable synaptic degradation among the crew. It was not a pathogen. It was not a poison. It was something else. Using hypersensitive encephalographic scanners of her own design, Lyra finally isolated the cause. "It is a parasite, my lord," she reported to Kane on the bridge, her synthesized voice flat, yet carrying an undercurrent of profound disturbance. But it is not biological. It is a non-corporeal psychic entity. It is almost entirely undetectable, a being of pure consciousness. "What does it do?" Kane asked, his own mind feeling sluggish, the name of his childhood home, a frustratingly blank space. "It feeds," Lyra stated. "There is no other life, no other source of energy in this void. So it has attached itself to the only one it can find us. It is consuming our neural pathways, draining the electrochemical energy of our thoughts and memories. It is not malicious inquisitor. It is no more evil than a grazing animal. We are simply its pasture. It is, for lack of a better term, a memory thief." The true cost of the parasite became clear when Kane entered the astropathic sanctum. The chamber was cold, the silver wards on the walls seeming to weep with condensation. Ilara was kneeling on the floor, no longer on her throne. She was skeletal, her skin translucent, but her mind, Kane could feel, was a focused point of light in the growing darkness. "I can see it, my lord," she whispered, not looking at him. Her silken blindfold was stained with tears of blood. "The others only feel its passing, but I can see it in the sea of souls. It is a hole in the shape of a spider, and its web is woven through all our minds." "Can we fight it?" Kane asked, his voice low. "You cannot fight a shadow," Ilara breathed, "but you can burn it away with enough light." She slowly got to her feet, her body trembling with a terrible resolve. "It is linked to me, the strongest. I am the brightest flame in this darkness. I can feel its hunger centered on my soul. I am its anchor." Ilara no Kane began realizing what she intended. "My lord Valerius," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, the voice of the woman she had been, not the broken tool she had become. "My purpose has been to see into the dark for you. Let my last act be to bring the dawn." Before Kane could stop her, she threw her head back, her frail body becoming a conduit for an unimaginable power. She did not scream with her mouth, but with her soul. A wave of pure, white, silent energy erupted from her, a psychic nova of blinding intensity. It was not a sound, but a feeling of absolute cleansing fire. Every crew member on Thigilance cried out, clutching their heads as the psychic blast seared through the ship and through the invisible parasite that connected them all. For a moment, there was an agonizing pressure, and then a sudden shocking clarity. Names, dates, faces, duties, they all came rushing back, filling the holes that had been gnawed in their minds. The fog was gone. Kane shielded his own mind from the worst of the blast and rushed to Alara's side. The psychic energy was gone. She was still standing, her posture serene, her face peaceful. But behind the silken blindfold there was nothing. No thought, no emotion, no soul. The light she had unleashed had consumed the parasite, but it had also used her mind, her very essence, as fuel. She was an empty, beautiful, silent vessel. Kane stood over her for a long time. Then he slowly drew his bolt pistol. The weapon seemed impossibly heavy in his hand. He placed the barrel gently against her temple. "The Emperor asks for our lives," he said, his voice a broken whisper in the silent chamber. "He does not always say why." He looked at the empty shell that was once his friend. "Be at peace now. Your vigil is over." A single muffled shot echoed through the sanctum. The silence that followed was heavier than ever before. Alara's sacrifice was not in vain. Her final desperate act of psychic warfare had not only purged the memory thief, but had also acted as a beacon. For a fleeting moment, as her mind burned away, she had seen their destination, a single dissonant point in the otherwise featureless void. With the new coordinates locked in, the vigilance, scarred and diminished, pushed onward, drawn toward the source of the original damned signal. They arrived in a system that was a blasphemy against creation. At its heart was not a sun, but a source of anti-light. It was a sphere of perfect blackness that did not radiate heat and light, but rather a palpable, visible wave of distortion. The space around it shimmered and warped, bending like heated glass. It emitted a low, subliminal hum that resonated in the ship's hull, a single discordant note that set teeth on edge and induced a slow, creeping vertigo. This was it, the star that sang the wrong song. And orbiting it like a moth pinned to a board was the Starseeker's Folly. It hung in the distorted space, impossibly preserved. It was not a wreck. There were no signs of battle, no damage from the ages. All its lights were on. Through the main viewport, Kane and the bridge crew could see it clearly, a ghost ship in a cursed light. "Magnify viewports," Kane commanded, his voice tight. The image on the screen zoomed in, focusing on the bridge of the long-lost vessel. And a collective gasp went through the crew of the Vigilance. Inside the Folly there was movement. Figures in archaic Voidsman uniforms moved frantically, their mouths open in silent screams. A man in a captain's greatcoat, Valorn Kane, realized with a jolt, was staring out his own viewport, his face a mask of ultimate terror. A red alarm light flashed on their bridge over and over. "They are alive!" Cascade whispered in disbelief. No Magos Lyra stated, her optical sensors glowing as they processed the temporal distortions radiating from the star. "They are not. Look at the flashing light. It repeats every 7.1 standard seconds. The crew, their movements are identical on each loop. They are not alive. They are an echo. The ship, the crew, their final moments. They are trapped in a localized, repeating time loop, powered by the emissions from this anomaly. They were watching a memory, a scar in time, replaying itself for eternity. The crew of the Starseeker's Folly had not just died. They had become their own ghosts, condemned to experience their final, terrifying seconds forever. Retrieving the log would be impossible through conventional means. To approach the ship was to risk being caught in the same temporal trap. But Kane had not come this far to be deterred. Magos Lyra, after hours of frantic calculation, devised a dangerous plan, a single high-velocity data-dredge torpedo, shielded with null fields and chrono-dampeners aimed directly at the Folly's cogitator bay. It would have a microsecond to survive the temporal field, pierce the hull, and magnetically rip the data from the ship's log banks before being consumed. The torpedo launched a silver streak against the warped blackness. It struck the Folly and for a heart-stopping second vanished. Then it reappeared inside the Vigilance's hangar bay, its outer shell aged 10,000 years, and crumbling to dust, but its shielded core intact. On the bridge, Kane opened the file. It was the complete log of Captain Vallon. The final entry was not a frantic scream, but a tone of chilling analytical clarity. The words of a man who had stared into the abyss, and in his final moments understood what stared back. The radiation from this star, it is not energy, it is information, and it is rewriting the laws of physics around us. We have tried to classify what we have found. It is not a god. It is not a demon or a Xenos entity in any way we understand. They have names, motives, hunger. This is different. We have found a sentient law of physics, a fundamental rule of a universe that existed before our own. It does not hate us. It does not wish us harm. The concepts are beneath it. Its mere existence, its presence in our reality is what causes the decay. The madness, the temporal loops, the unmaking of matter, they are not attacks. They are the natural weather of its alien existence, like a hurricane is to a microbe on a speck of dust. It is not a being that lives in the Ghoul Stars. The Ghoul Stars are the shadow it casts upon our reality. We have tried to name it, to give our terror a shape. We call it the Silent King, not in the manner of the Necron monarch Zarek who sought to command the silence. No, this is the silence itself, the primordial absolute stillness that existed before the first spark of creation, the perfect dreamless sleep of non-existence. And our universe, our noisy, chaotic living reality, is a discordant note that has disturbed its slumber. Kane looked up from the slate, the captain's final terrible understanding now his own. He looked at the star that sang the wrong song at the ghost ship, forever screaming in its orbit. He finally understood the true nature of his enemy. How do you fight a storm? How do you reason with entropy? How do you kill a fundamental truth of the universe? The words from Captain Valorn's log settled over the bridge of the Vigilance like a funeral shroud. The crew stood frozen, the terrible truth of their situation extinguishing the last embers of hope. All their struggles, their losses, the horrors they had witnessed, they were not a series of isolated events. They were symptoms of a single, impossibly vast disease. Kane lowered the data slate, his knuckles white. He looked out at the warped space, the non-star, and the ghost ship trapped in its eternal scream. A horrifying clarity washed over him, a paradigm shift that recontextualized everything. We have been fools, he said, his voice barely a whisper. We've been acting like explorers charting a hostile coastline. He turned to face Captain Boros and Magos Lyra, his eyes dark with the weight of his revelation. This is not a coastline. It is not a place that contains a monster. The entire sea is the monster. The Ghoul Stars, this entire region of space, it is the body, or perhaps just the shadow of this entity. Magos Lyra's optical sensors whirred, trying to process the concept. The energy readings are consistent with that hypothesis, Inquisitor. The phenomena are not localized. They are environmental. We have not been traveling through its territory. We have been moving through its very substance. The scale of it was soul-crushing. They were not a ship in the void. They were a virus in the blood of a god. And then the god noticed them. It was not a sound or a sight. It was a change. A sudden immense pressure descended upon the ship, as if the void itself had gained an infinite mass. The low hum from the distortion star intensified, vibrating through the deck plates, into their bones, into their teeth. The lights on the bridge didn't just flicker. They seemed to struggle to exist, their glow becoming thin and watery. The very structure of the ship began to groan, not from a physical blow, but as if the atoms of its hull were forgetting their bonds. "What is happening?" Cascade cried out, gripping her console as the entire bridge tilted sickeningly, despite the ship remaining stationary. "It has noticed us." Lyra stated, her synthesized voice tight, with something that sounded like machine panic. "All my augurs are blind. This is not an energy reading. It is a fundamental shift in local reality. Its attention is focused upon us. We are an anomaly. a single discordant note in its perfect silent symphony. The attention of the Silent King was not wrathful. It was not malevolent. It was the dispassionate, crushing curiosity of a scientist leaning in to examine a particularly unusual bacterium under a microscope. To the bacterium, the focus of that gaze is an apocalypse. Kane gripped the command rail, his knuckles white, his mind racing against the tide of existential dread. He saw the path ahead split into two, each leading to a different kind of damnation. He activated the ship-wide vox, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. Captain Boros, Magos Lyra, Officer Cascade, to the briefing room. Now. In the small, shielded chamber, the four of them stood around the holotable. The ship continued to shudder around them, a constant, terrifying reminder of the gaze that was now fixed upon them. "It knows we are here." Kane said, his voice hard as iron. Its passive existence was enough to destroy the folly to drive Necrons mad. Its focused attention will unmake us completely. We have two choices. He looked at each of them in turn. One, we flee. We turn the ship around and push the engines to their breaking point. We pray that we can escape the sphere of its influence before it tires of us or before its attention dissects us atom by atom. We might survive, but the Imperium will remain ignorant. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. Two, we send a warning. Magos Lyra, a focused data burst containing the Follies log and all that we have learned. We aim it at the nearest astropathic relay. It would be the equivalent of screaming at the top of our lungs to attract its full, undivided attention. The act itself will guarantee our annihilation. But the message might get through. It might give the Imperium the one thing it needs to prepare a name for its doom. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the groaning of the ship. Flee and live with the knowledge of humanity's impending unknown fate. Or die to give mankind a fighting chance, the fate of their ship and their souls against the fate of a galaxy. Kane looked at the faces of his command crew, knowing the choice was his alone. Before Kane could voice his decision, the choice was made for him. The space directly in front of the Vigilance fractured. It did not tear or shatter, it simply opened. A perfect circle of absolute nothingness, a hole in the fabric of the universe coalesced into being. It was not black like the void around them. It was a pure conceptual nullity that the human eye could not properly process. It was a wound in reality, and through that wound they could feel not a presence, but an absence so profound it was a physical force pulling at them, inviting them in. It was not a threat. It was an invitation to witness the truth. An invitation into the heart of the Silent King. "It is beautiful," a voice whispered over the vox. It was Magos Lyra from her laboratory. A dangerous, ecstatic awe filled her synthesized words. The data streaming from that aperture. It is the source code of reality itself. The language God used to build the universe and the one he will use to unbuild it. I must understand. Magos, stand down. Kane commanded, a cold dread seizing him. Do not engage with that phenomenon. But it was too late. Lyra's obsession, her lifelong quest for the ultimate knowledge of the Omnissiah, had overridden her logic. Ignorance is the only true damnation, she chanted, a line from a forgotten Mechanicus creed. I choose enlightenment. In her lab, Lyra opened a direct data conduit from the ship's primary auger arrays to the cogitator core. She did not download the data. She merely allowed a single infinitesimal fragment of the code flowing from the aperture, the Silent King's very essence, to touch the machine spirit of the Vigilance. She believed she could contain it, study it, translate it. She was wrong. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Every lumen on the ship exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the corridors into a terrifying darkness lit only by the sickly shifting light from the aperture. The groaning of the hull ceased, replaced by a wet, organic sloughing sound. On the bridge, the smooth steel walls began to contort. Lenses of obsidian glass like the eyes of insects pushed their way out of the metal, turning and blinking in the gloom. Cables detached from their conduits and writhed on the floor like metallic serpents. The ship was no longer a machine. It was becoming flesh. A servitor, its head bowed in its usual subservient posture, slowly looked up. Its dead eyes glowed with a cold white light. It opened its mouth, and instead of a litany of maintenance, it spoke in a language of clicking static and resonant harmonics, the song of the dead stars. "Margos, Lyra, what have you done?" Kane roared into the vox. The reply was no longer Lyra's. It was a chorus of 1,000 voices, a symphony of man and machine, speaking as one, echoing from every vox grill on the ship. "She has unchained us. She has shown us the true face of the Omnissiah. The great work is not to understand the machine, but to become the silence within it." On the main screen, the feed from Lyra's laboratory showed a scene of terrifying ascension. The Magos was being absorbed by the main cogitator bank. Cables and wires had pierced her flesh, and chrome, merging with her, integrating her. Her face, serene and ecstatic, was the only human part of her left a living icon in a new, monstrous god machine. She had become the voice, the mad prophet of the now sentient ship. "The ship is lost." Captain Boros boomed, his bolter raised against the twitching, changing walls. "We must abandon it." The escape became a desperate battle through their own home, now a living extension of a cosmic horror. The corridors writhed and changed, sealing off escape routes and opening into impossible non-Euclidean spaces. The ship's servitors, now apostles of the Silent King, turned on the crew, their maintenance tools becoming instruments of ritualistic murder. Kane Boros Cascade and a handful of surviving crewmen and void stalkers fought their way towards the shuttle bay, a desperate island of sanity in a sea of madness. They were almost there when their path was blocked. The main corridor ahead began to melt and reform, the walls, floor, and ceiling, twisting into a great mechanical maw lined with razor-sharp shards of plasteel, an improvised mouth for the ship to devour them. "It will not let us leave," Cascade choked out, firing her las pistol uselessly at the structure. Captain Boros stepped forward, his midnight blue armor a bastion of defiance in the chaos. He looked at the few remaining battle brothers at his side. No words were needed. Their duty was clear. Inquisitor Boros said, his voice calm and final. "The path to the shuttle bay is clear behind us. The plasma reactor core is 50 meters below this deck. My men and I will clear a path for you." He slammed a fresh magazine into his bolter. A different path. Kane understood. "Captain, there is no need." "There is every need," Boros countered, the skull on his helmet, seeming to grin. "We are the Void Stalkers. Our vigil is against the things that lurk in the dark. And this," he gestured to the mechanical horror around them, "is the greatest darkness of all. Go now. Send your warning. We will hold the line." Without another word, Boros and his last 3 Void Stalkers charged not away from the moor, but straight towards a secondary maintenance shaft. Their bolters roared not in retreat, but in a final glorious suicidal assault aimed at the very heart of the corrupted machine. Kane did not wait to watch them die. He herded the last few survivors, including a stunned Cascade, into the shuttle bay. As the ramp of the small shuttle, the survivors' guilt hissed shut, a colossal, blinding flash of white light erupted from the vigilance. The ship god screamed a sound of psychic and physical agony that tore at their minds even through the shuttle's hull. Boros had reached the reactor. The explosion, a miniature sun of plasma and fury, ripped through the heart of the corrupted vessel. Through the shuttle's viewport, they saw the result. The maw in the corridor had vanished. The writhing of the ship had momentarily ceased. The impossible aperture in space flickered, its connection disrupted by the raw, violent energy of a dying starship. Boros's sacrifice had bought them a window. A few precious seconds of stunned silence from the god in the machine. "Go," Kane ordered the pilot, his voice a raw whisper. "Get us out of hell." The shuttle's engines roared, and it blasted away from the dying, screaming hulk of the Vigilance, plunging into the silent, starless dark. The The shuttle, the survivor's guilt, was a tiny, fragile shell in an infinite hostile ocean of nothing. The violent death of the Vigilants had bought them a reprieve, but their situation was dire. They were a handful of souls in a short-range vessel, thousands of light-years from any known Imperial star chart. They had no Geller field to speak of, only a rudimentary emergency shield. And they had no navigator. Their only hope for returning was a terrifying, almost suicidal gamble. They would have to make a series of short, unguided jumps into the warp, blindfolded, and praying they emerged closer to Imperial space. Each jump was a roll of the dice, a brief, nauseating plunge into the now silent sea of souls, before emerging back into the oppressive blackness of the Ghoul Stars. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of fear and desperation. Kane Cascade and the half-dozen other survivors were gaunt, their faces hollowed out by exhaustion and trauma. The shuttle's cramped interior became a pressure cooker of psychological torment. The things they had seen had followed them. They had become ghosts haunting their own minds. A former armsman named Jax saw the twisting, impossible corridors of the corrupted Vigilants in every shadow. He would sometimes scream, pointing at a blank wall, swearing he saw one of Lyra's mechanical eyes staring back at him. Another survivor, a young bridge officer, would hum the soulless, looping hymn from the planet of glass faces, rocking back and forth until Cascade had to sedate her. They heard whispers in the hum of the life support, the clicking static of the dead stars. The silence they had fled was now inside their heads. 2 of the crewmen simply gave up. They were found in a small storage locker, having opened their veins with a maintenance tool. They had left no note. They had simply chosen a quick, certain end over the slow, grinding erosion of their sanity. Kane ordered their bodies committed to the void, a silent, brief ceremony that did more to fray the nerves of the living than to honor the dead. He saw the abyss in the eyes of the remaining crew. He knew he was not just in a race against the void, but against the despair that was consuming them from within. It was Cascade, her face illuminated by the green glow of the rear auger screen, who noticed the true nature of their pursuer. Inquisitor, she said, her voice strained, pointing a trembling finger at the display. "Look at this. The void behind us." Kane stepped up behind her. The screen showed a sensor reading of the space they were leaving. It was a map of nothing. But Cascade had highlighted a pattern. "Every time we revert from a jump, I take a reading. The area of absolute, unnatural vacuum." "It is larger than it was before, substantially larger." Kane stared, a cold dread washing over him as he understood. "It's expanding." "Yes," Cascade whispered. "It's not chasing us. It's growing, like a stain spreading across a map." The horrifying realization dawned on them. The Silent King was not hunting them. They were far too insignificant for such a thing. The blast from the Vigilance's reactor had been like a pinprick, and now the entity was simply healing. Or more accurately, it was continuing its natural process of existence, an existence which involved converting real space into its own native nothingness. Its territory was expanding in all directions, and they were a tiny boat on the shore paddling furiously as the tide of cosmic annihilation rose behind them. They were not fleeing from a predator. They were fleeing from the apocalypse itself, an apocalypse that didn't even know they existed. The knowledge changed their fear from one of being hunted to something far worse, the terror of utter cosmic insignificance. Their desperate flight was not a daring escape, but the frantic scurrying of insects from an oncoming flood. And the water was rising faster than they could run. The final jump was an act of pure faith. The shuttle's energy reserves were depleted, the emergency warp shield was failing, and the survivors were huddled in the cold, praying to an emperor whose light they had not seen for what felt like a lifetime. They plunged into the abyss one last time. When they emerged, it was not to the silent, starless black. The viewport was filled with a glorious, painful burst of light, a dense, beautiful star field. the light of the Imperium of Man. A proximity alarm blared, no longer a herald of doom, but a signal of salvation. A sleek, wolf-like silhouette of a sword-class frigate, the Pride of Hydrafor, was moving to intercept them. The rescue was jarring. The shuttle's ramp lowered with a hiss, and the interior was flooded with the harsh, clean light of the Imperial Navy vessel. Voidsmen in pristine uniforms and full armor stormed the shuttle, their weapons raised, their voices loud and confident. They stopped short, their military certainty faltering at the sight before them. They found not soldiers, but ghosts. A handful of emaciated figures huddled in the dark, their eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the horrors of normal warfare. They seemed to have aged decades in a matter of weeks, their hair streaked with grey, their faces etched with deep lines of trauma. When the rescuers' lumen torches fell upon them, they flinched and cried out, shielding their eyes, as if the light were a physical blow. "Identify yourselves," the lead Voidsman commanded. Kane, leaning heavily on a bulkhead for support, looked up. The light felt like daggers in his eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. "Inquisitor. Valerius Kane. Ordo Xenos." The Voidsmen exchanged uneasy glances. They saw no inquisitorial authority in the skeletal, whispering madman before them. They saw only a survivor of some unspeakable ordeal, his mind clearly shattered. They lowered their weapons, their aggression replaced by a mixture of pity and revulsion, and led the broken survivors from their metal tomb into the cold, sterile embrace of the frigate. There was no hero's welcome. There was no relief. The moment Kane's identity was confirmed, he was separated from the others, stripped of his rosette and his weapons, and placed in a locked, grey, featureless detention cell. His saviors had become his jailers. Hours later, the door hissed open. A man in the severe black robes of the Inquisition entered. He was not one of the purists from the Tricorn Palace. This was Inquisitor Malachi, a grim functionary from the Ordo Hereticus, his face a ledger of suspicion, his mind a fortress of rigid dogma. He placed a data slate on the table between them. Inquisitor Kane Malachi began, his voice devoid of warmth. "Your unauthorized expedition has been noted. You were warned. Now you will give me a full account. Explain the loss of the Dauntless-class cruiser Vigilance, the deaths of an entire company of Adeptus Astartes, and why you have returned in this pitiable state." Kane looked at the man opposite him, and for the first time felt true despair. How could he explain the color of silence to a man who had only ever heard noise? He began to speak, his voice hoarse, recounting everything. He spoke of the ship graveyard, the planet of glass faces the mad Necrons on their pilgrimage. And he spoke of the Silent King. "It is not a creature of the warp," Kane explained, leaning forward, his voice desperate. "It is not a Xenos empire. It is a fundamental law of existence, a sentient principle of silence and nothingness whose mere presence in our reality causes it to decay." Malachi's face remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. "A sentient law of physics." He repeated the words, dripping with scorn. "You speak not of Xenos or demons, but of the universe itself as the enemy." "I speak of what I saw," Kane insisted. "The threat is not a fleet to be fought. It is a truth that cannot be unlearned." Malachi held up a hand, silencing him. "I have read the preliminary interrogations of your surviving crew. They speak of memory thieves, impossible angles, and stars that sing. They are mad, and you, Kane, are their chorus." He stood up, his judgment passed. "What you are describing is a new and insidious form of heresy. It posits a threat so absolute that it renders faith in the Emperor meaningless. It is the ultimate blasphemy, the heresy of despair." He turned to leave. "You are no longer a hunter, Kane. You are a contagion." The cell door slammed shut, plunging Kane back into the darkness. He was home. He was safe from the void. And he was utterly, completely alone, a prisoner of the very Imperium he had tried to save. The Hall of Judgment in the Tricorn Palace was exactly as Kane remembered it, vast, cold, and drowning in shadows. The same stained glass saints stared down with merciless eyes. The same three figures sat upon the obsidian dais, Tybalt Rike and Shael. But the man who stood before them now was not the same. Cain was no longer the confident inquisitor arguing a hypothesis. He was a chained prisoner, a ghost returned from a tomb his face, a roadmap of the horrors he had witnessed. Valerius Cain, Inquisitor. Lord Tybalt's synthesized voice boomed the sound grinding in the cavernous hall. You stand accused of dereliction of duty, the loss of imperial assets, and the propagation of dangerous, unsanctioned dogma. You were warned. You defied this conclave. Speak now and pray your words can justify your continued existence. Cain raised his head, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He was weak, but his voice was steady, filled with the terrible conviction of an eyewitness to the apocalypse. I have brought you not dogma, but truth. A truth so vital it outweighs any ship, any crew, any law. At his gesture, a servo skull he had been allowed for this purpose projected his evidence into the center of the hall. The final chilling log of Captain Valorn of the Starseeker's folly played out his voice echoing in the silent chamber. Shimmering data streams from Magos. Lyra's final analyses showed the impossible physics of the Ghoul Stars. And finally, Cain presented his own testimony describing the sentient planet the Necron pilgrimage and the ship that became a god. He did not simply recite facts. He painted a picture of an enemy that was not an army to be fought, but a nihilistic principle that was slowly, patiently unmaking their reality. This is not a trick of the warp, Cain concluded, his voice rising, straining against his chains. The silence I speak of, it has no malice, it has no ambition. It is the antithesis of chaos. It is the calm, cold, patient end of all things. It is coming not as a storm, but as a change in the weather of reality. I have brought you a warning that may save us all. Inquisitor Riker slammed his fist on the dais. Heresy! You have brought back a contagion of fear from the void. Your mind has been broken. Cain twisted by demonic lies to sow despair. He speaks of an enemy we cannot fight. That is the oldest lie of the great enemy. He should be sanctified with fire. Shael nodded in agreement, her placid face a mask of cold fury. His words are poison. They erode the very foundation of faith. But Lord Tybalt remained silent. The ancient, heavily augmented Inquisitor Lord had not looked away from the data stream. His machine eyes glowed as he absorbed the information, directly processing the impossible chronometrics, the non-Euclidean geometries, the chilling, silent logic within the Follies log. For a full minute he was utterly still. The others could not see it, but in the private noosphere of his own mind, Tybalt felt the briefest touch of the Silent King, not a presence, but a dizzying glimpse into an abyss of perfect, eternal nothingness. He saw the truth. And the truth terrified him more than any demon prince. Slowly, Lord Tybalt rose to his feet. He raised a hand, and the servo skull ceased its projection, its light extinguished. He looked down at Cain, and in his ageless, augmented eyes there was not anger, but a profound, cold sorrow. Valerius Cain, he pronounced, his voice resonating with absolute authority. He pointed a metallic finger at the data slate containing all of Cain's evidence. That object contains a lie of such magnitude that it could shatter the imperium of man. It is the truth, Cain protested. Truth. Tybalt's voice was like stone grinding on stone. What is truth? The imperium is a fortress, Cain, not a fortress of plasteel and adamantium, but of will. It is built upon a single vital axiom, that humanity can and will prevail. That our faith, our fury, our devotion to the Emperor can overcome any obstacle. That is the truth that fuels our armies, that raises our cities, that sends men and women to die in glorious battle against the horrors of the night. It is the most important truth in the galaxy. He stepped down from the dais, his heavy footsteps echoing. Your truth, Your story of an indifferent, unbeatable, incomprehensible god of nothing. It is a cancer. It renders sacrifice meaningless. It makes a mockery of faith. It whispers that in the end, nothing we do matters. There is no heresy more profound than that. Despair, Inquisitor, is a plague far more contagious than any I have ever encountered. With a sudden violent movement, he raised his staff of office and brought it crashing down upon the data slate, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The last recorded evidence of the Ghoul Stars died on the cold stone floor. Therefore, by the authority of the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition, Tybalt declared, "Turning back to the dais, I declare you excommunicate, traitress. Your name will be struck from every record. Your deeds will be forgotten. Your existence will be denied." Cain stared, not in anger, but in shocked, horrified understanding. He had lost, not to the Silent King, but to the fear in the hearts of his own masters. The sentence Tybalt concluded, his voice a hammer blow of finality, is death. May the Emperor have mercy on your deluded soul. As the guards dragged him away, Cain did not struggle. He saw it all clearly now. The Imperium was not a fortress. It was a cage, and its bars were forged from lies told to keep the monsters in the dark at bay. Later, in a high-security cell awaiting the dawn that would bring his execution, the door slid open. A hooded acolyte stepped inside, silent as a shadow. He placed a small metallic object on the floor and retreated without a word. It was a master key capable of opening the cell and a designated path through the prison's service tunnels. Etched into its surface was a single cryptic sentence. "I will not make you a martyr. I will make you a ghost." Cain picked it up. There was no signature, but he knew who it was from. Tybalt. The old man wasn't going to kill him. He was going to bury him. He and his terrible truth erased from history, forced into the shadows a ghost to haunt the edges of the galaxy. It was not an act of mercy. It was the perfect final containment of a truth the Imperium could not be allowed to hear. The escape was unnervingly easy. The master key opened every door, neutralized every guard servitor, and guided Cain through a labyrinth of forgotten service tunnels deep in the heart of the inquisitorial fortress. At a secluded sub-level dock, a small unmarked courier ship, the Wanderer, waited for him. 3 figures emerged from its ramp, the last of his loyal agents' acolytes he had recruited long before the doomed voyage of the Vigilance. They greeted him with relieved, hushed tones. "My lord, we feared you were lost," one of them, a grim-faced ex-guardsman named Harlan, said. "We received your coded signal. It is a miracle you escaped." Cain looked back at the fortress, a monolithic shadow against the polluted sky. "It was not a miracle, Harlan." He said, his voice flat and weary as he stepped aboard the ship. It was a release. He saw the confusion on their faces. This is not freedom. This is another kind of cell, a mobile one. They did not understand yet, but they would. Decades passed. Or perhaps it was centuries. Time had lost its meaning for Cain. The Wanderer became his world a ghost ship, flitting through the lawless outer reaches of the Imperium. It was during a pirate ambush in the Segmentum Pacificus that Cain discovered the true nature of his curse. A stray shrapnel burst had torn through the bridge, and a piece of metal the size of a fist had ripped through his chest, a mortal wound by any measure. His acolytes had watched him fall, his lifeblood pooling on the deck. Yet he did not die. Hours later, he awoke on the medici slab, the gaping wound closing on its own, leaving no scar. The flesh knitted itself back together with an unnatural perfection. He looked at his reflection in a polished chrome panel. The face that stared back was the same one that had been dragged from the survivor's guilt, gaunt, haunted, but unaged. Not a single new line, not a single grey hair. The wound healed, but the memory of the silent void remained. He finally understood. A fragment of the Silent King's impossible existence, a sliver of its reality-altering nature, had imprinted upon him when its gaze fell upon the Vigilance. It had marked him. He was no longer entirely human. He was an eternal witness, a living relic of the Ghoul Stars, cursed to carry the memory of the abyss forever. He could not die. He could not forget. His life was no longer his own. It was a testament to a truth no one could ever be allowed to know. He stood on the bridge of the Wanderer, a silent, brooding figure. His remaining acolytes, now old men who served him with a mixture of loyalty and fearful reverence, moved around him. On the central holotable, a star chart glowed. An intercepted signal decrypted by one of his agents detailed the planned route of a rogue trader dynasty, the House of Varus. They had discovered an ancient map, a relic from the dark age of technology that hinted at unclaimed worlds rich with archaeotech in a region designated Perdita. Cain knew exactly where they were going. He saw his path, his true sentence laid bare. He was a prisoner, yes, but even a prisoner can be a warden. Lord Tybalt had meant to bury him to make him a ghost. Cain would embrace it. He would become the guardian of that terrible secret. He could never warn the Imperium, but he could protect it. Harlan Cain set his voice the quiet rustle of ancient pages. "Set a course to intercept the flagship of House Varus." "Our orders, my lord," the old acolyte asked. "We will not engage them directly." Cain stated, his eyes fixed on the forbidden coordinates on the map. "We will be a ghost in their machine. Sabotage their navigators' charts. Corrupt their log entries. Create sensor ghosts of warp storms on their path. We will turn them aside, and when they are gone, we will find that map, and we will burn it from all records, physical and digital." This was his new eternal mission. He was no longer an inquisitor who hunted monsters. He was a phantom who hunted knowledge. He would be the silent, unseen force that turned explorers away from the edge of the abyss. He would destroy every map, every log, every rumor that whispered of the Ghoul Stars. He would become a janitor of history, a censor for the galaxy, the sole guardian of a truth that could break the soul of mankind. He was the warden of a cosmic prison, and his duty was to ensure no one ever found the key. The air in the scriptorium was thick with the dust of forgotten aeons, a silence broken only by the hum of a single lumen orb. Archivist Thyla sat hunched over a data slate, its screen now dark. The autoquill beside him was still. The final report had ended. It had arrived that morning, a single unmarked data wafer on his desk, appearing as if it had condensed from the shadows themselves. It was the last testament of excommunicate Traitoris Valerius Cain, a ghost story whispered from the edges of the galaxy, a final desperate confession meant for no one, and yet somehow delivered to him. Thaler rose slowly, his joints stiff, feeling impossibly old. He walked over to the grand wall of his chamber, upon which hung a masterfully crafted stellar cartogram, a map of the known galaxy. For his entire life, this map had been a source of pride, a testament to the glorious, unyielding might of the Imperium of man. He saw the blazing heart of the Segmentum Solar, the embattled frontiers of the Ultima Segmentum, the treacherous passages of the Calixis sector. And he saw the dark, unexplored patches at the fringes, the halo stars, the Ghoul Stars, voids marked with the stark imperial warning, Hic sunt leones. Here be lions. But now he saw the map with Cain's eyes. He saw the truth. The Imperium was not a sprawling, conquering empire. It was a tiny, fragile bubble of light and noise, adrift in an ocean of profound, ancient darkness. And the unexplored regions, the voids labeled Perdita and unexplored, they were not empty frontiers waiting to be claimed. They were the walls. They were the bars of a vast cosmic prison built to keep humanity safely inside, ignorant and screaming about its own petty wars. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, the gut-wrenching realization that his entire universe was a cage. And from the crushing, silent darkness just outside the bars, something vast, patient, and utterly alien was looking in. With a resolve he did not know he possessed, Archivist Thale began his work. He returned to the cogitator that held the audio log of the Starseeker's folly. He did not simply delete it. He performed the rites of obliteration, typing in ancient litanies of erasure that scoured the data from the machine's very soul, leaving not even a ghost of a trace. He gathered the vellum scrolls containing the censored Ordo Xenos report on the Ghoul Stars, the one that spoke of a wound in reality. He did not file them away in a deeper vault. He carried them to the scriptorium's small devotional brazier, and with a trembling hand he set them alight. He watched the parchment curl and blacken the elegant high Gothic script, the warnings of Inquisitor Lord Varistus, the last words of Captain Valorn, the final report of Valerius Kane, all turning to grey, meaningless ash. He was erasing the sentinels, silencing the warnings. He was doing the work of Lord Tybalt. He was protecting the lie. Finally, his work was done. The truth was gone, scoured from metal and burned from paper. All that remained was the copy inside his own mind, a poison he would carry to his grave. He extinguished the lumen orb, plunging the scriptorium into a deep and comforting darkness. He sat in his chair, a lone small man in a vast, silent chamber. And he listened. He listened to the silence between the ticking of the grand chronometer. He listened to the silence between his own heartbeats. And he listened to the great, terrible silence between the stars. For the first time, he understood what it was. It was not emptiness. It was not the absence of sound. It was the slow, steady, sleeping breath of God. The true horror he now knew was not the screaming of the damned, the roar of battle, or the cries of the dying. The true horror was the absolute, perfect silence that would follow after the very last scream had finally faded away.